your first table saw is really exciting. It can also be somewhat scary. As you probably know, the table saw accounts for more accidents than any other tool in the shop. So what I want to do today is to walk you through some safety practices with your new table saw, as well as some basics on how to get started, so that this can be a tool you will use for a long time. You will find so many uses for, and it will probably become the heart of your power tool workshop as well. Now, if this is your first table saw, you're probably starting with what is called a job site or a contractor saw, like this. These saws are small, portable, and more affordable than their larger counterparts. If you follow woodworking videos online, you might have seen people using larger versions called cabinet saws, like this. Regardless of the size of the saw, the basic functions are still the same. This is the throat plate or insert that sits down over the blade. And one of the first things I would recommend is getting what's called a zero clearance insert. Now, you'll still need the original plate if you're doing any sort of bevel cut, so I'm not saying that that's not good. A zero clearance plate simply has less room around the blade so that thin slices of wood can't jam into the spaces between the blade and the plate when you're cutting. This won't matter much for larger pieces, but in general, I just find that less space is better. Now, the second part I want to talk about here is this little metal piece in the back. This is called the riving knife. Sometimes it's called the splitter. And hopefully any table saw you use should have one of these. A table saw blade spins at somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 revolutions per minute. Now, that's a rough number. Some are higher, some are lower, but let's break it down. At 3,000 revolutions per minute, we are talking about 50 complete revolutions per second. And at 5,000 RPMs, that's 83 rotations per second. That is far faster than you or anyone can possibly react, and the results can be devastating. Here's how this works. When the blade is spinning, it cuts downward at the front, where the wood is introduced. But in the back, these teeth are spinning in an upward trajectory. As the material passes through between the fence and the blade, it needs to remain straight in order to bypass those teeth. Now, the smallest movement toward the blade can result in those teeth catching, which would throw the wood like so. Let's talk about the blade guard for just a moment. You can see that on this saw, the blade guard is part of a floating system that can be pushed out of the way. And on this saw, I can't find it. So you will notice that a lot of people remove their blade guards. Let's talk about that for just a moment. I'm of the mind that anything that keeps your fingers away from the blade is a good thing. The reason you'll see a lot of people removing blade guards, well, there's a few reasons. One of them is that if you're cutting smaller material, the blade guard can get in the way of the cut. There are also certain functions you cannot perform with the blade guard on. Again, I think whenever possible, you probably should leave it on. I do think it can be a safety device in that way. However, it's not like the riving knife in terms of there's just no excuse not to ever have it off. Steve Ramsey of Woodworking for Mere Mortals has a great video on this. I'll link it. He goes over the pros and cons of it far more than I'm going to here. Blade height. Your blade should not be more than about 1/4 inch or 1 full blade tooth above your stock, roughly. Okay. Now, I've been guilty of this when I'm ripping lots of stock of varying thicknesses, but really you need to lower the blade so it's not sticking way out above your stock. And the reason for that is, one, it's a protection again for your fingers, and two, it keeps the wood from catching. The physics of it are, of course, that the more blade you have out, the more there is a chance of something flexing just a little and catching. So that is why we leave the blades down to just above the height of the stock. You have probably heard of and are somewhat familiar with the idea of kickback. The riving knife will help with kickback that is the result of drift. Another thing you'll want to do is to make good use of a push stick. Now, there are lots of these on the market. The one that came with your table saw is basically worthless for thinner stock. This type, something like this, tends to work much better. Now, in terms of gripping the stock, I'm a big fan of the micro jig because it has these holder things. The basic concept, of course, is to keep your fingers well clear of the blade. I also like that the micro jig, the handle is angled such that it's going to push your stock next to the fence as well as through. So I think this is a great product. Any of these tools are going to help keep your fingers away from the blade. I do also recommend what's called a feather board. There are, again, lots of these on the market. This one is called the Hedgehog. I need to be better about using this. I'm really good at using it when there's multiple pieces of identical thickness stock. These are great. These are fantastic. So what you do with these ones is they sit down in the saw's miter slot here and spin this around, spin it enough, and tighten it up. And what this does is it'll allow the stock to move forward through the blade, but it catches it on return to keep it from throwing it back at you. A couple more pieces of safety advice. When you are cutting, stand just barely left of the blade. That way, if there is any sort of kickback, you're not going to catch it in the gut. And finally, keep your eyes on your work. And not just your eyes, but keep your head in the game. 84% of table saw accidents happen because of distraction. I absolutely made up that number, but it's probably right. In the accidents I've heard of, usually there's some moment of distraction of something that's taking your mind off of your work, whether you're tired, whether there's a sound, you're looking away for some reason, you're reaching for something. These are things that can happen to anyone. So keep your eyes and your head on your work. Finally, keep your blade sharp. You've heard this before. A dull knife, a dull blade is an accident waiting to happen. In the case of a table saw with a dull blade, if you're trying to shove that stock through, that can result in an accident. Keep your blades sharp, replace them when they need it. I lied, there's one other thing. Don't reach over a spinning blade. Okay, now, I know that sounds obvious, but it's very tempting when stock is pushed through here. You finish the cut, it's very tempting just to reach over and grab that back. Don't do it. Turn off your blade, okay? Or go around, turn off your blade as best, and never ever attempt to fish a piece back through a spinning blade, ever. Okay, that covers the basics of table saw safety, and I hope it was helpful. The purpose was not at all to be frightening, but to help you understand how you can safely operate your table saw so that you can ensure the longevity of your own fingers. Once you know and you can follow these things, there is just so much you can do with a table saw. Now, there's one thing I want to add, and that is that if budget allows, by far the best thing you can do to ensure that you never cut these off is to buy a saw stop. Now, I'm not sponsored. I wish I was, but I have one for myself and I love it. It is an amazing saw. If you're not familiar with these, they work, what they do is they conduct a small amount of electrical current. And if your body comes into contact with this blade while it's running, your body is conductive, and it will set off the charge so that the brake, which is down inside here, will activate. It will catch the blade, pull it into the body of the saw, and shut off the motor, all in 5 milliseconds. I actually don't even know how to conceive of how short an amount of time that is, but if you go online, there's lots of demonstrations using hot dogs to show how fast it'll grab it, and people left with tiny little nicks instead of having a finger taken off. So these are fantastic saws. They do have a job site version that is more affordable than these big ones. I don't think you have to reach a certain level of woodworking to be safe. I think everybody should, if they can get one, keep your fingers safe. So that's my little thing for that. They are also just great saws. They are very good saws. So that's that. I recommend them. Wouldn't do anything else because it's a long-term investment, and I would like myself and my family to keep our fingers. So, all right, let's move on from there about the basics of how to actually cut some wood, shall we? All right, there are 3 main types of cuts that you're going to make in wood. The first one is a rip cut, and that is a cut that goes along the grain. Table saw excels at this type of cut. Now, a cross cut, by contrast, goes across the grain. Okay. Now, these sorts of cuts can certainly be done on the table saw and are all the time, but there are additional safety measures that you'll want to take. Another type of cut is called a resaw, and that's where the board is cut parallel to the face. Okay. The table saw is limited in what it can do with this kind of cut. So first, the rip cuts. This is probably what you'll want to use your new table saw for the most. And what I want to do here is spend a moment to understand the fence. But before we get started on rip cuts, I do want to say that when you set up your saw, you're going to need to make sure that your fence is parallel with your blade. And you can do that by checking a measurement at the front of the blade and the back of the blade to make sure that those are dead on in distance between the blade and the fence. And periodically, you're going to want to do that as well. Less expensive saws will need to be checked more often. The other thing to check is you'll have a ruler down at the front of your saw down here that'll tell you how far your fence is from your blade. That's not always going to be accurate. Now, that's more so true on a less expensive saw, but even on a more expensive saw, you're going to want to check that periodically and make sure that it's right on. My old DeWalt job site saw you saw a little bit ago, I've had that for 7 years. It does a pretty bang up job actually, but I still check it up. I still check on those settings when I take it out on a job site. Okay. After that, in understanding rip cuts, you'll want to make sure that you have one square edge. That's your reference side. That's going to reference against the fence, which is not locked. There we go. That's going to reference against the fence. If you have an uneven side, you're simply not going to produce a square cut. To make a cut, begin by turning on the saw so that the blade begins rotating before introducing the material. Guide the wood through the blade, keeping it firmly against the fence. Do not force wood through the blade quickly, but use slow, steady pressure to feed it through. Use your hands to get the piece started, but as you near the back side of the board, use a push stick to guide the lumber while keeping pressure toward the fence as well. I like to use another guide to do this. Power off the saw, and then grab your cut piece. Cross-cutting on a table saw requires some different safety measures. As you can see, if I were attempting to cross-cut this, there's just too much risk that I'm going to twist or bind and end up hurting myself. So the most basic tool that comes with the saw is your miter gauge. And now this fits into the miter slot, which is what these two slots are called. And it allows you to hold the piece in place and cut it. Now, the safer option is to create a sacrificial fence by clamping, or there's some slots here. You can screw this piece of wood in. Now, if you have a long piece, I recommend doing this because it's going to take some of the flimsiness out of your piece and also prevent the tear out, which is that tearing of fibers that you're going to get. And if you have it backed up to a piece of wood, you're not going to get so much tear out. So to do this more safely, I would attach this fence to my miter saw, to my miter gauge, excuse me, and then clamp this piece of wood to it. And now when I'm pushing this through, it's steady, okay? And these can be turned and used to bevel cut as well. I don't like to do that, but you can do that. The other thing to understand is that you do not want to run this against your table saw fence. There's again risk of twisting and binding that's going to come with that. So you want to find your measurement and push it through, okay? Now there are jigs, there's things like the Incra guide and things like that that can be used for cross-cutting. Those are great. I don't have one. This is my preference for cross-cutting. This is a shop-made cross-cut sled. It's pretty simple. Some people go more elaborate. And this allows me to take a piece of stock, square against the fence. I can clamp it, I can hold it, and I can make cross-cuts all day safely as can be. I like one of these. You may not make one right away when you're just starting, but over time, consider this. This is a very large one, obviously. You make them to fit your saw. What I also like about this is it allows for repeat cuts. So if I'm wanting to cut a piece this wide, I wouldn't feel safe doing this. Maybe on the miter saw, as it gets smaller, I wouldn't want to do it. So I would simply set a block of wood which I don't have near me. Let's say that's wood. And I would clamp it here, move it to the next one. Finally, a brief word about resaw cuts. Okay, again, these are parallel to the face, so you're literally splitting this board however much you want. Frankly, the table saw does not excel at them. You've only got a 3-inch height, about 3 inches available here. That's a lot to push through. That's hard on a motor. It's okay, you can do it for smaller pieces. I don't love it. For one thing, your kerf on a standard table saw blade is about 1/8 of an inch, and that takes a lot of material. In this case, the bandsaw is just the best tool for the job. So there are limited applications where you can do that on a table saw, but excelling at it, not so much. That's more the purview with the bandsaw. All right, I can't tell you all of the ways that you can use a table saw in your shop. That is up to you to learn on your own woodworking journey. For myself, I can tell you that I use my table saw for so many things. I've used it to do mortises, box joints, dados, rabbets, half laps, tapers, spleens, tongue and grooves, miters, all sorts of things. The table saw is the heart of my workshop. And over time, it will probably become so for you too. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot them my way. I hope that this has been a useful introduction, and I'd love to hear how your own journey goes as you become more familiar with your table saw.